I'm really excited to be with you today to talk to you about the latest trends in global Christianity. I'm a missionary at heart who produces reference books, so sometimes it's difficult to understand what I do. And this is no more clear than it is in my own family. Here's a picture of my daughter, Valerie. We were moving from Singapore to Gordon Conwell, where I'm now working, and the very first Sunday was Mission Sunday. And so they took my little girl into the Sunday school room and they asked the kids, does anybody here know a missionary? And she immediately raised her hand and said, my dad's a missionary, but he never tells anyone about Jesus. So that week, I spent time with my little girl trying to explain how hard I worked and how I went to school and got my doctorate and was trying to send information all around the world. So the next Sunday, she went to Sunday school, and before anybody could do anything, she raised her hand and she said, my daddy's a doctor, but he can't help anyone. So I guess I'm a bad missionary and a bad doctor, but nonetheless, I'm really committed to this work. Perhaps you've seen the Lego Bible and you've thought to yourself, wait a minute, this guy counts, and isn't counting an evil thing to do? And so David found himself in this position, but it's important for us to know that it wasn't the counting that was wrong, it was the pride in counting that got David into trouble. So we're not going to get into any trouble today. This is all about the good kind of counting. Now, I produce reference books. Here's the Atlas of Global Christianity. It's a very large book, not as large as this screen, but it's enormous, full of color, has all kinds of things in it. But look at the cover. The cover immediately tells us that we're living in a different age than perhaps in the past. The artwork is from the southwest of China, and it's called Jesus the Resurrection. And we thought it was appropriate to put Chinese art on the cover of a book about Christianity in 2010, and we're going to get there very soon. So first of all, this is a very exciting subject because Christianity is all over the world, and yet here we are. Christians have been just a third of the world's population for the last 100 years. If you're in the hospital and you look over your shoulder at the machine and there's a line like this, probably the last thing you'll ever see. But this hides some important trends underneath this fact. The most important trend is a huge shift from the north to the south. And we see it here. Christians, 66% of all Christians in 1910, Europeans, another 15% are North Americans. Together, that's more than 80%. Now, keep your eye on that big chunk of 66%. We're going to go 100 years into the future. Here we go. And look at that, 66% down to 25%. Even the North American percentage has shrunk. And what we have now is a world where less than 40% of all Christians are Europeans or North Americans. That means the vast majority of Christians are Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and Islanders. That is a huge shift. So what does that shift mean? I was really helped by this young Chinese design artist who moved from Beijing to Berlin. She noticed a profound difference between German culture and Chinese culture. So let's look at her graphics. Here we have punctuality. On the left are the Germans in blue, on the right, the Chinese in red. The Germans here, always right on time. The Chinese, well, 15 minutes or so doesn't make a difference. Those of us who have been in Latin America know that it could probably go all the way around the clock for Latin America. Big difference. How about handling of problems? Here we see the Germans walk straight through the problem, and the Chinese make themselves around a little bit more subtly. Then we have the queue and waiting. The Germans all lined up neatly, and the Chinese bunched against the window. Opinion. Germans very direct, but the Chinese around in circles there. Very different approach. Finally, we have contacts, and you can see here the Germans have a few contacts, but the Chinese are in a great web of relations. Now remember, we said earlier that Christianity has shifted from north to south. So in a real sense, it's shifted to German-like cultures to Chinese-like cultures. And so when we look at the scriptures and try to discern the foundations of our faith, they look a lot more like the cultures on the right than on the left. And this is especially true when we get to the way of life. Here we have the individual on the left, a group on the right. Most groups today, or most Christians today, are people who are more comfortable with groups. And yet, most of the training and most of the thinking, even the singing and so on, is written by people in cultures on the left. And that's a big problem. We need to see a change. I have a friend in Malaysia who's a Chinese background, and he wrote a book called Mangoes or Bananas. And his concern is that Asian Christianity is too much like a banana. It's yellow on the outside, white on the inside, indicating that European, North American training that is so prevalent even in Asia. But he said, wouldn't it be beautiful if Christianity was more like a mango, which is on the right, yellow on the outside, yellow on the inside. I think that's where we're headed. What we don't want is this. That's the value of travel, kids. You get to see how people in other cultures live, and it's just Gap, Starbucks, McDonald's all around the world. That's what we don't want to see that happen as Christianity continues to spread. That's, for one thing, 50% of all Christians in the world are going to be Africans probably as soon as the year 2050. That's a very different world than the 1910 world. We have another problem in that we're fragmented. There are 45,000 Christian denominations in the world. Reminds me of a joke that I once heard of a man who was stranded on a desert island. He was there for many years. Finally, a ship came along to rescue him. The captain comes down from the ship and lands on that island and sees this man and says, "How did you live here all of these years?" There's 3 huts on the island. And the man says, "Well, the first hut is where I've lived all these years. The second hut is where I go to church." And the captain said, "What is the third hut?" And he said, "That's where I used to go to church." So even one person can't stay in the same denomination. In addition, we have all these languages around the world that are now part of Christianity. What do you think the number one mother tongue of Christianity is? You're right, it's Spanish. More Spanish speakers than any other language. That's because of Latin America, not Spain. Of course, the second most numerous is English. And here we have the British royal family. Third is just like Spanish, but it's Portuguese. And this is not because of Portugal, which is tiny, but because of Brazil, which is very large and dynamic. Fourth are the Russians. This is the Russian Orthodox Church with a huge population. And then surprisingly, the 5th largest mother tongue is Chinese. And this again shows the shift of Christianity from north to south. We have a big challenge in global Christianity of persecution, especially in the Middle East. 22% in 1910, down to 5% Christian in 2010, and we think less than 3% Christian. It's really a crisis in places like Syria, Iraq, and Turkey, and even Egypt in North Africa. So this is something you can be praying for. So what do we do about all of this? Well, first of all, we want to resist Mickey Mouse and McDonald's as they travel all around the world. This is not Christianity. Christianity is not a Western business, which is franchising itself everywhere, even if it's somewhat sensitive. We want to see indigenous churches spread everywhere. We also want to see a reverse in the flow, because globalization has been largely from the West to the rest. But in Christianity, we want to see the flow go in the other direction. We need to listen to Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and Islanders. That's who we really are. We're from all these different places, and this is essential for the future. So the question is, are we a divided community? As we talked about 45,000 Christian denominations. We're just a bunch of pieces on a canvas like this, none of them related with each other, no particular purpose. Is that who we are? I don't think so. I like to think of us more as a unified community, as all these different parts mean something. They fit together. Everyone has a part, and that is a better definition of who we are. And then finally, it's time for us to live like a global community, since that's who we are. We're from every continent, all these different languages. We should look as if we are global, in the sense that when anyone encounters us, they encounter this amazing group of people from all over the world with all these different cultures, not bound by a single culture, certainly not just Western, but something that's just amazingly global. And that's the message that I have for you today. Thank you.